Good evening and welcome everyone to tonight's talk. This is the fifth in the City of Hudson series of speaker events organized by the Office of Mayor Kamal Johnson to center Indigenous voices, stories, and issues throughout Native American Heritage Month. My name is Michael Hoffman. I am the mayoral aide and ADA coordinator for the City of Hudson, and over the past few months, I have had the pleasure of working with the city's first ever Indigenous consultant, Heather Bruegel, on creating this incredible and important series of events. Heather would be joining us to make the introduction tonight, but has regrettably come down with a cold and will be focusing on recovering. So we send her all the healing energy tonight and hope for her speedy recovery. Tonight, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Meranda Roberts to this virtual space to speak with us about collaboration between arts institutions and Native American communities. Dr. Roberts is a citizen of the Yarrington Paiute tribe as well as Chicana. In 2018, excuse me, a second. In 2018, she earned her PhD from the University of California, Riverside in Native American history. She worked as a co-curator at the Field Museum of Natural History, where she developed content for the renovation of the museum's 70-year-old Native American exhibition hall, now titled Native Truths, Our Stories, Our Voices. She is also the co-host for the award-winning podcast Exhibiting Kinship, and is currently an independent museum consultant. Miranda's passion lies in holding colonial institutions like museums accountable for the harmful narratives they have painted about Indigenous people. She is also dedicated to reconnecting Indigenous collection items with their descendants. Through the use of Indigenous methodologies as well as public history pedagogy, Meranda examines the harm colonialism continues to inflict on Indigenous communities and how public institutions can correct these wrongs. You can find out more about Miranda's work, including links to talks on land acknowledgements and anti-colonial methods, on her website, mirandaWritesHistory.com. Before I turn it over to Dr. Roberts, I do just want to respectfully remind everyone to remain on mute for the duration of tonight's talk. We will have an opportunity at the end for a question and answer, and we feel free to use the chat to submit questions whenever they come to mind. With that, I will hand the floor over to you, Dr. Roberts. Thanks again so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. I'm in California right now, so it's still 3 p.m. So thank you for having me here today. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to Heather, who asked me to be a part of this and who can't join us, unfortunately, but who is someone I consider a sister in this world as we work on making sure institutions better understand how to work with Native people. So it is great to be here and to share space with you all here today. I'm going to go ahead and just start by sharing my screen and getting the ball rolling. A little bit about me. I'm an open book for the most part. You can ask me basically any question as it relates to museums or institutions or the work that I have done, and I am more than happy to answer questions and to give you ideas. But again, anything I talk about here today is just solely based off of my experiences and things that I think museums could do better at addressing colonial harms, but it's not set in stone. Everything is changed. I change on a daily basis. So it's an evolving door, but one that I hope that we can all continue to learn from. So I will go ahead and just get started. But first, as we all know, hopefully, that we always need to begin these conversations with land acknowledgements. So as a Northern Paiute woman, it's important for me to acknowledge that the city I'm in, Riverside, California, is the homelands of the Cahuilla, Tongva, Merriam, and Luiseño people, whose prayers and traditions, sciences, and vast knowledge has maintained this land since time immemorial. It is all up to us as guests on our homelands or wherever we may be tonight to do our part in respecting Native sovereignty and incorporating Native voices and representation in anything that we do, because Native people have everything that you may need to figure out what goes into your institution. We have ideas, we have sciences, we have methodologies that you can all benefit from. And I hope that some part of tonight you take with you to how you can incorporate that into your own work. And again, it's always to remember that we are all on Native land. No matter where we are in the world, we're on some form of Indigenous land. And I encourage all of you to think about how you can learn more about the history of whose homeland you're on At the end of the talk, I will go ahead and provide links to some of the resources that you can provide to, or that I will provide to give you more information about land acknowledgements and to find out whose land you're on. So I wanted to start tonight off with some important facts, because I've come to realize when doing these sorts of presentations, those who are in attendance may work at a cultural institution such as a museum or art gallery, but a lot of times those institutions don't know some of the numbers that go along with doing this work. And again, I will provide links to this information that I found so you can follow up with it. But I wanted to make sure that it was important for you to understand the context to which I'm providing. So there are 574 federally recognized nations in the United States. And those are just federally recognized tribes. There are numerous other non-federally recognized tribes in the United States, with, I believe, over 18 here in California. And there's a lot of discussion over what goes into federal recognition, but I encourage you all to do more research about what that looks like. I could give a whole lecture on that within itself, but I think it's important to recognize that a lot of us in our communities are, not me and not mine, but a lot of our communities are still working towards federal recognition to get the sovereignty and to maintain the sovereignty that we rightfully deserve. 72% of Americans almost never encounter or seek out information about Native Americans. And if they do, it is typically about our past. It's about the ways in which we lived prior to contact. It is very much a romanticized version of who we are as a people. And I believe that museums have had a big role in sustaining those traditions, or in sustaining that type of talk. Meaning, I believe that museums as institutions have done their fair share of harming how we are represented in public spaces, how we are talked about in public spaces, and that they need to take up they need to take the role of repairing how our relationships and how our histories have been talked about in the public realm. And there's ways of doing that. It's just that a lot of times institutions are afraid of acknowledging their harmful past because it may not look well, or it may give them a bad name. But I don't believe that that's necessarily true. I believe that as Indigenous people, we all want to connect with the cultural items that are housed at a cultural institution. We just want to be able to be treated fairly and righteously. And a lot of times that means having to do a lot of internal work before any other work can go forward. And I'll go into that a little bit more. Native American characters only make up between 0 to 0.4% of primetime TV and films. As many of you may know about reservation dogs that you can find on Hulu, it's important to figure out what other methods of entertainment are out there. I encourage everyone to look up Predator on Hulu, as it's a great film. And you can sub it and dub it in Comanche. And it was done with a Comanche producer. And so there is modes of changing in which we are bringing about proper representation. It's just starting to look different. And I think a lot of times non-Native people fear what looks different because they are so used to us being from the past, that when they start to see us in the present, they begin to realize that there is a big gap in their knowledge, and that scares them because that means they have to fill it in. And I am here to say that that's okay, that knowledge can be filled in. It just takes time, patience, and a lot of humility, but it's not impossible. And the last point, when Google searching Native American, 95 of the first 1,000 images are from the 19th century, which means that we are inherently stuck in a role that was never designed for us. And what I mean by that is when you had collectors, white anthropologists going into our communities to take items to have representation within museum spaces, they were the ones who were creating the narrative about who we are and who we were. And it's up to these institutions now to give us the mantle to say, this is actually who we are. We were never what those anthropologists said we were, and we're still thriving here today. Because if we don't continue to push for proper recognition, we're going to continuously be seen as nothing other than the 1900s. And I work very hard, as well as Heather and other consultants and other people who I know are here in the audience, to fix those types of misrepresentations and misconceptions about our communities. And it is very vital because visibility matters. So I think I messed up. Okay, so sorry, my slideshow got a little messed up, but there's reasons and there's consequences to when stereotypes are upheld. And that is that they provide politically convenient excuses to ignore our realities. That people, if they only see us as living in one sort of way, if they only see Native people as all people who don a certain sort of outfit or regalia, then all of our experiences are not taken into account. And it's up to us as people, as all of us here as humans, to figure out how do we better educate ourselves about about the lived experiences of Native people, so that you can become advocates in challenging these stereotypes and eventually dismantling them. And I won't go into all of these points right now, but I just will say again that I believe that museums, not all, not tribal museums, I'm not making blanket statements about that, but a lot of the major museums that we deal with in society today have helped cause some of these stereotypes that are that have led to these consequences today. So going back a slide, most of this information you can find on your own in Amy Lone Tree's book, Decolonizing Museums. I went ahead and grabbed some of her, some of the work that she did and provided page numbers here. But also it's based off of the experience that I had working at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. So, and I provide those photos here because they're the best ones that I could find and have access to, but also they help explain the point that I'm trying to get across. That the history of museum representation of Native people began with the development of anthropology as an academic field. And as you all know who are here tonight, that began by going into communities, by studying us as Native people for who we were and how come we weren't making as quote unquote much progress than white counterparts or those who came to settle the land. And with that came dire consequences like what I mentioned earlier, but also this improper ways of representation that you see in both of these photographs. Now, since these photographs have been taken, this all has changed. However, what I'm doing is using it as an example for the fact that when something like this hasn't changed, you as an institution or as an individual are producing harm. Because as you see in these photos, you don't get to know about the in-depth history related to any of the cultural items that you see here on display. You don't get proper identification about who the people may have been, what their lives were like, what their lives are like today, the stories behind many of the beautiful adornments that are accompanied with these items, as well as the stories of survival that accompany them. And when you do this, and when you walk through something like this, which is typical of a natural history museum, or even sometimes an art gallery, you are failing to recognize us as still living people. You're failing to see that we still have dynamic ways of engaging with the environment, with society, with our own methods of research and living, that you don't get the full picture. And unfortunately, when we're presented in these ways, you're still seeing us as a mechanism of how those white anthropologists wanted us to be seen. You're not getting the full picture. And within that, a lot of these collection practices were harmful for Native communities. A lot of times these white anthropologists would go into our communities. Sometimes they would pay for the cultural material that they would take back to a museum, and other times they would steal them. There's documentation regarding that as well. But again, I always have of the mind of, okay, so this happened, now what? Now what do we do? Because at the end of the day, these museums, these institutions still house these items, and they are still worthy of the respect and dignity that our ancestors put into the creation of them. But what are we going to do to change how they're interpreted? What are we going to do to ensure that nothing like these presentations that you see here today, it happens again? And a lot of times when I work in an institution, a lot of times people across the board don't know how to work with Native communities because they've never had the opportunity to do so. Or there's this other time where they have worked with Native communities, but it's only ever been maybe for like 1 or 2 projects, and maybe there isn't consistent collaboration going on, and which is fine. But if you want to really dig deep and not have to continuously build new relationships for every new project, there are a series of steps that can be taken to ensure that there is longevity in your institution for proper representation of Native items. And again, I'm not only saying this as blanket as I can. Every situation is different. Every community has different needs, but there are ways that I believe that an institution can get itself ready ahead of working with collaboration. Because I will say that before the Field Museum did its renovation of this 70-year-old hall, there wasn't a lot of collaboration departmentally about how well do we work together? How do we want to work together? How can we get to know each other better so we understand each other's worldviews? So that way, when we run into hardship or confusion, we can do so in a good way and not cause any harm or any fights, right? There is so many different things that go into this work that I think a lot of places don't fully understand, that I want them to. So changing the narrative, I know that's why you're all here. Like, what is that about, right? What goes into this? And so I'm going to use the example that I have right now of changing the narrative at the Benton Art Museum at the Claremont Colleges in Claremont, California. Because it is here that I have found there is some hard institutional history that is somewhat difficult to address. However, there is also a lot of good that is there that makes community excited to work with the institution. However, before being able to approach those types of conversations, I had to ensure that the museum was prepared to do that sort of work. Because at this particular institution, there is no there's no full-time Native American art curator. At the moment, we're hoping that will change. So, but as a guest curator, as someone who deeply values community above all else, I wanted to make sure that the institution knew what it had to do before beginning this work. Because there's one thing for me as a curator to go in and tell a story. If I go into a collection, yes, I could choose different items to say, this is the story I want to tell. However, I want to look at what stories have not been told and why. And typically the stories that haven't been told are about the collection history themselves. And so I want to bring that into the fold and into the narrative of any exhibition that I'm doing, because I believe it provides context for visitors at better understanding how a Native art collection may have been assembled, and then how those things can represent Native American art culture. So when I was asked to begin this current curation about Cahuilla basketry, which is now titled Continuity, Cahuilla Basket Weavers and Their Legacies, I didn't initially jump in and say, yes, I'm going to do that. A little bit of background, my work has been in Native American basketry, particularly Cahuilla, because that was the focus of my dissertation. So I knew the community a little bit more. I have more familiarity, I have more contacts. And so the museum was like, we want to work with you to help bring in those narratives. However, I was like, wait, I want to make sure that the people I'm bringing in are going to feel safe, not physically safe, but emotionally safe, to be able to express themselves in this space freely, to be able to connect with their ancestral items in good ways without any sort of interference, as well as to make sure that the institution knew what it meant to collaborate with these communities and the people I was bringing in, because I didn't want to bring them in and just have that be that. And that was it, a one-time guest curation opportunity, and that was it. Instead, I wanted to make sure that every person at this institution met with each collaborator, spent time with them, and got to know them on a personal level. So that way genuine relationships can start to develop. So a big part of that was helping staff identify, which they have. The one person there, his name is Steve. He has institutional memory. So he knows exactly every project that a Native person may have helped to facilitate in the past. He's also instrumental in helping identify the ways in which the collection has been used in the past, which is very insightful as well. I also had to help staff talk about some of the difficult histories that is affiliated with this collection, which I'll go into a little bit, but it helped that I provided them with a list of resources for some of that background. They read it all together as a staff and then came back and talked about it. So that way it wasn't that I was bringing in Cahuilla people to educate the staff. Instead, I was like asking the staff, how about you do some self-education, and then when the Cahuilla or whoever I might bring in, they know that they don't have to pick up any of the extra legwork, that you are ready to meet with them, okay, that you're meeting them on some even level.
So you mean little bubbles or big bubbles? Little bubbles.
And then I also had to educate staff about the importance of reuniting collection items, because I recognize that a lot of spaces, and again, this isn't the case for everyone or every institution, but a lot of spaces still have walls over how a community can access their cultural items, meaning that there maybe have to be a rigorous amount of paperwork that has to be filled out before you can go into a collection. Maybe only certain groups of people are allowed into a collection. And I'm not saying that that's the case here, but I really wanted to let the institution know that those types of things need to be not a barrier but more of a record keeping. So that way, the descendants feel like they have the space to make that space their own. And then identify the appropriate way of using those collection items for exhibition or interpretation. And sometimes that's not, that you don't get to use them. And what I mean is, for example, there's an artist at this institution who wanted to use some Kuya items in their exhibition that wasn't anything a lot about Native American culture. And the people I work with didn't have a problem with them using it. It was about the way that it was being interpreted. And in this case, yes, some of the cultural items they didn't want to have interpreted in that way, and they didn't want to have used. And that is what the purpose of bringing these two modes of communication together is they weren't saying no to full-on collaboration with this non-Native person or artist. Rather, they were asking, how about using other items to get this point across? So that way we're not being disrespectful to our ancestors and their knowledge, but also we want to be as collaborative as possible to keep showing how beautiful our culture is. And sometimes those conversations can feel uncomfortable, but they are what gets they are what gets the job done. And they do end up leading to a lot better understanding across the board. So some of the questions that I asked the staff at the Benton, but I also ask almost any institution that I work with now, are these series of questions. Because after the experiences that I've had at the Field Museum, also as a grad student, I realized that as institutions work on quote unquote decolonization, again, these institutions and those in power really don't understand what that word means. It's typically seen as a checkbox, meaning, okay, we hired a bunch of Native people, now we can check that box off and we're decolonizing. When in reality, decolonization is really digging deep into yourself to figure out what sort of biases that you have as a non-Native person that are preventing you from making headway with Native people. It's also about dismantling the systems of power that have kept Native people in a box, quote unquote. But also more than that, that's why I don't know if decolonization is possible in the realm that we live in today. However, I do believe in anti-colonial practices that can open up all of our minds to how can we become more anti-colonial in the hope that someday, somewhere, there is a decolonized world. And so here are some of the questions, and I can explain some of them for further inquiry. Again, I believe every institution needs to do an inventory on how they have, and I hate that word, but it's the best one I have right now, of how have we worked with Native people in the past. Looking at across the departments, maybe only registration worked, for example, maybe only registration worked with a Native artist at one point, for whatever reason. Why was that the case? Why were they siloed to a department? What kind of ways can we ensure that that siloing doesn't happen again? And how can we ensure that the communication that is happening across departments is shared, right? Because maybe a Native artist is sharing valuable information to that registrar, but it only exists with them. So how do you make sure that your exhibitor or your development person also gets that information? What are some of the ways that we prevent Native people from having to repeat themselves over and over about the same thing to multiple different people in the same institution? Because when that happens, it feels as if we're not being listened to, that we're not being taken seriously, and that maybe the institution doesn't care as much as it says it does. And so it's very important to understand that institutional history from this lens as well. And if you have attempted to collaborate with Native partners in the past, what went well and what didn't work well? Maybe it worked well that one individual only met with you quarterly, but you had another individual who you had to meet with almost every week, right? Acknowledging the limitations of your system is just as important as recognizing the limitations that your collaborators might have. Because there might be instances where a collaborator doesn't necessarily give you as much time as you would like, but another one does. How do you make sure that they're both treated well and with the same respect as everyone else? And most importantly, what didn't work well? Was it because of the timing? Was it because maybe financial barriers of the institution? Was it because you couldn't find anyone to work with? And start to really examine what keeps us as an institution from doing this work. It's very important to navigate that. And has your organization overlooked Native voices in the past? If yes, why? And I know that this question can get very uncomfortable for many reasons. However, it's important to acknowledge because of the fact that it has happened. At the end of the day, none of us here today in this society hopefully are not the reasons for the for how history has played out, right? We're not responsible for what happened in the past in 1900 for what those anthropologists did. However, we are now getting the consequences of their actions. And now we have to figure out how do we rectify those things without producing more harm. And in some ways, maybe we overlook Native voices at one point because it was just easier to do so. Admit that to yourself. I'm not saying that any of this has to be made public, but admit that to yourself. And if you ask yourself these questions personally, also ask them of your institution and vice versa, because it's very important to address the biases that come up as you're working with collaborators, because trust me, there will be a moment when you're not understanding a Native worldview where you're going to have to check yourself and be like, you know what, this isn't my worldview, but I'm going to have to let that go in order to make sure that the person I'm working with feels like I'm doing a good job. And maybe I don't understand it, but I can ask questions. And I haven't worked with Native people in the past because I've been too afraid to do so. And if that's the case, that's okay. But let's start thinking about what it means to be comfortable in doing this work. Again, what misconceptions do you have about Native people? How do you plan on addressing these? The biggest gripe I have about doing this sort of work is a lot of people believe that, as I showed you in the numbers earlier, that we all look a certain way, that we all are a romanticized version of the past of the 1900s, that we all have the same lived experiences, that we all think the same way, that we all do the work the same way. And in reality, that's not true. It's about getting to know people on a very personal level. So that way you can get to know them as we are as normal people. I just shared this earlier today, a lot of times when I'm approached about, well, how do I even start to collaborate? It's how do you even start to build a friendship, right? If you really want to build a friendship with someone, you go out of your way to make sure that what they have, like that you're communicating well, that you're being transparent, that you're being honest, that you're doing things to take time, that you're taking time to get to know them and to spend time with them and to learn from them. You're not being extractive. None of this should, hopefully, I hope all of you here are not taking this work and just like, this is to make my institution better. I hope that it is also something to make you want to do this work better on a personal level to continue to be a healthy human being in the world that we live in, right? So think about it as not just an institutional learning capability, but also as a self-education capability. Again, this means you having to address privileges that you may have as an individual that prohibit you from making sustainable relationships, right? Sometimes it's like for me, what gets in the way are people may think that my degrees, I'm too academic based, like I don't have any connection to my community, which is further from the truth. But because they don't get to know me or they only see the privileges that I have, that stops them from getting to really know who I am and what I represent. And also is unfair to the many Native communities who come to work in these institutions. And how has your organization caused Native people harm? Again, I'm not saying that every institution is like this, but there have been moments in a lot of institutional history that have hurt Native people, whether through collection practices, whether by ignoring Native voices or needs in the past. It has happened, but that doesn't mean that you've completely stopped doing the work. It's just acknowledging, okay, we did this in the past. How do we talk to our audiences about what we did and why it was wrong? Because let me go back a few pages, when you have visitors who are going through and seeing exhibitions like the photos you see here, this is what they are learning about Native communities. They're not learning much. They're not learning anything at all. In fact, they are kind of seeing us as faceless individuals, right? And when you're seeing that for years and decades on hand, you're taking that knowledge with you as if we are no longer existing. And therefore, there has to be some sort of way that we address how this education of Native culture was done, why it was wrong, and what we're doing to work to fix it in the future. Because again, a lot of people, regular non-museum folks or institutional folks, don't realize how Native items got to a collection. They don't understand how these things were collected. They don't know that institutional history. And instead, they're taking what we have to say as museum professionals as 100% fact. And when that happens, there's not a lot of room to reinterpret things unless a full renovation is done, or unless the institution takes it upon themselves to rectify the wrongs that have happened. So again, and I'm using my example at the Benton as another type of example to show you how you can do this work doing well. So again, it starts by identifying institutional history. So when I was approached about curating a show about all of these baskets that you're here today, I started to think about, okay, who was the collector? What were they thinking? What was their purpose? How come these baskets? How come not others? Right. But I quickly found out that the person who collected this his name was Emil Steffa. He graduated from the school that these baskets are housed at, and he donated them back to the school once he passed away. Now, what made this particular collector very different was he actually recorded the names of the women he collected from, and he actually took their photographs, which you see in the top photo here. So we know who some of these baskets are related to, and we also have photos of their relatives, right? And then, but within that, as I started to dig deeper, I noticed that at the school, and this might be a little controversial, but at the school, there was Steffa's mentor, the person who collected these baskets, was a man by the name of David Prescott Barrows. And he was an ethnohistorian about Cahuilla people. And he went up to some of the mountains here near Riverside, California, where he saw the Cahuilla performing a ghost dance ceremony. And he was so inspired by that, he took the ghost dance song that they were performing and made it into the school song that they performed for up until the early 2000s. And what makes that particularly interesting to me is that the ghost dance started with my community. I come from the people and from the, we call them in English, prophet that dance came from. So when I was thinking about doing this work, it kind of felt like a sign that this was the work I was supposed to be doing. Then lastly, I looked at this particular page from Emil Steffa's book, Basket Weavers of the Coachella Valley, where he says towards the end, this means nothing more or less than the passing of the art of basketry from among this people. The minute I saw that was that these baskets were collected for the idea that one day all of us would disappear, that the idea that because no one at that time was actively engaging in basketry, on the same level that they were back before settlement, that it automatically was this assumption that it would just disappear just like Native people. When in reality, that's furthest from the case. When you open up your doors to Native people and Native basket weavers to have access to collections, you will have an experience like no one else has. You will see how these baskets started. How did these women start these baskets? What materials did she use? Are we able to what happened to these types of designs? Because maybe we don't do them as much as we used to, right? So there's a wealth of knowledge that goes there, that goes into these visits, that people can then take with them into their everyday lives and begin to revitalize that art from a new lens and from a more contemporary lens. And it's actually a thorough line, because in my head, just because these pieces were taken from community doesn't mean that connection ever stopped. Within these baskets is the DNA of those basket makers, from the way they collected grasses. It is their prayers are also there, and the ways in which that they understood the world are there. And so there is so much knowledge behind these pieces that is yet to be unlocked because of not having access to them, but also because, as I believe that these are living ancestors that have lessons that want to be told, but we just need to take the time to listen. And when I was doing this work, and I will say, I learned that Donna Largo, who is a Cahuilla band member, who was a Cahuilla Santa Rosa Band of Cahuilla Indians, curated an exhibition that featured these baskets in 1994. So I recognized that this institution has done this work in the past, that there was institutional history here, but now how do I begin to talk about that in an exhibition if it's possible? How does the museum begin to move forward past these moments into making good, sustainable relationships after having asked all of these questions and having them reflect on them? So this is where we are today. So after all of that, which took about a year and a half, I would say, of us having gone through the questions, having sat in space to talk to each other. And when I say we go through the questions, I mean the director is also there. So I'm very much appreciative for the museum director and all of those on staff who take the time in their staff meetings to address the questions that I provided and to figure out internally what they could do to meet some of the things that I was asking. And trust me, that's not something that happens across the board, but rather shows dedication that when this work is approached in those good ways, it is possible, but you just have to take the time to make yourself a little bit uncomfortable in doing this work. So where are we today? Well, we're thinking about creating community-only events, such as the picture that you see here. We had something like this in July, where we opened up the collections to Cahuilla descendants to come visit with the baskets. We also had some of the women who are related to the basket weavers there, who were talking to us about their family members. One thing about these baskets is that they were not treated with any sort of pesticides. Such as arsenic or anything like that. So we are able to touch them without gloves, as well as pick them up and examine them very closely. So making sure that there's only events that Cahuilla people can participate in that allow them to have access to the collection. When we also did this, we had bird singers go into the space and people held the baskets as they were being sung to. And it was really a healing experience. I will speak for myself about bringing the past into the present and moving forward. Moving beyond the land acknowledgement and seeking opportunities to cultivate plants at the museum and a nearby land conservancy that weavers need for their weaving. So the museum right now is thinking and talking with my collaborators that I brought to them, what plants do they need to have access to, how much, and what other ways can they make their land accessible to the Cahuilla whose lands they're on, as well as the Tongva Nation. The director, like I said, goes out of her way to meet with artists, community members, and being actively engaged in the process. Whenever there's something that comes up that maybe she is unfamiliar with, or maybe something that goes against how she may view things, we talk about it. We have honest conversations with each other about the work and how do we move forward. And sometimes, there could be situations where like my worldview meets up with her worldview, but at the end of the day, I know that both of us have good intentions and we want to do this work right. Lastly, we want to do an exhibition so right now I'm curating an exhibition that honors the lives, past, present, and future of Cahuilla basket weavers. So I don't want to go too much into this because it's still a development. I officially just signed on to be the curator after I wanted to be sure that the museum was on board with my style of curating. So I began to take these ideas and begin to develop an exhibition about them. So I wanted to honor land, a section about land, so everyone would know which land they're on, whose they are, and how they can find out more information. Again, Donna Largo's work. Donna was someone who was instrumental in making sure basket weaving didn't disappear from the region. So I wanted to make sure that the work that she did was not forgotten either, because I think a lot of times when we do this sort of work, we forget to pay homage to the people who have been doing it for so long. And I don't think that that's done on purpose. I just think that that's because sometimes we're faced with such harsh deadlines or we have to move quickly that sometimes these things just get moved to the side. But for me, it was very, very, very important, because Donna is no longer with us, to make sure that people knew that it was a Native woman who was doing this work to sustain these traditions. And to tell the true story of Emil Stefa, meaning that there is going to be a section where there's a timeline that discusses who Emil Stefa was, that touches on the Torchbearer song, and that people can learn more information about Pomona institutional history, while also learning from basket weavers. We have a section that will highlight ancestral works while also displaying contemporary creations from descendants, such as the women who are displayed here. They're going to be creating new baskets that accompany these historic baskets, as well as maybe poetry from a Cahuilla poet, other installation work, she'll add, who are also related to the women and men who created these historic baskets. All of this that ties into the name, continuity, that we as Native people are still here, have been here, and always will be here. And I think what stops a lot of people too from doing this work really well is that, people come in and are like, well, I'm not Native, I don't have the right to say these things. And as on some level, that is what stopped me from doing this work, because I'm not Cahuilla. However, I decided let's make a story that's specific to Pomona's history, to this college's history. And this is the result, is when you've done the work, when you've done the work at addressing some really hard histories, when you're given the space to be able to talk about those things in a fair light, then you can create something that honors all parts of who we are and not just stick us in a mold because of out of fear. And then lastly, there'll be a catalog that addresses this history, a commitment from the museum moving forward and working better with Native cultures, as well as voices from the Cahuilla community. It's very important, and people might be like, why are you the Cahuilla? At UC Riverside, the Cahuilla community allowed me to take Cahuilla language courses. They give a lot of their knowledge and selves to understanding land and learning about their histories. And I feel that whenever I'm in a space, when I'm not on my own homelands, it is my responsibility to uplift the voices of the Native people whose land I'm on. If I'm not doing that, then that's a problem, because they deserve to have those stories told no matter what the circumstances are. And I believe that that's it. I will stop and go ahead and answer any questions you may have. I'm sorry I spoke so fast, but I just worry about not having time for any questions at the end. But I'm happy to answer any questions. Please feel free. Anything is on the table, even really hard questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. I invite anyone who wishes to have to speak their question aloud, just please raise your hand through the reactions box, or feel free to write your question in the chat. We'll give folks a few moments. Thanks, everyone. Well, I can start, Dr. Roberts. You mentioned that you just signed on to continue working with the Museum at Pomona College. Are there any other projects that we can look forward to seeing your work at potentially?
I am working right now. It was something that I dropped when I left Chicago to come back to California. But I'm helping to pick up some of the pieces that aren't there, about Native American veterans and it's called the Long Indian Wars. So thinking about Native American veterans here in the States, but then also thinking about how the process of war has also hurt like Palestinians, and how maybe these wars and the wars against Indigenous people mimic each other, look familiar, and how the process of recovery is also the same with many different artists as well. So it's a big project, but I'm hoping to be able to help narrow some things down in that regard. And other than that, right now, I say in the Exhibiting Kinship podcast that I just came out with my co-host that I haven't taken a break in 10 years. So like I went from undergrad to right to the career I'm in right now. And so I'm taking time to figure out what I actually want to do, as opposed to just the load of work that suddenly gets dropped off at my feet.
Yeah, that's extremely important. So we have a question in the chat. How many projects like this exist around the country, led by others?
Oh, I think that there's numerous, and I think it happened. I don't have an exact number, but I think that they happen in many different stages. I think that you have some institutions who are very large, who have, not unlimited funds, but who have high-end budgets, who really dig deep into how do we change our interpretation of Native people, who have advisory committees, who are dedicated to it. And then you have other more smaller institutions like historical societies, or even just local history museums, that are figuring out that maybe their little institution, and I don't mean little in like importance, I just mean little in stature, maybe how they've ignored certain people's histories. So when I'm back here in California, the first museum that I ever worked at consulted with me about how do we begin relationships with the local Tongva community, because we've only ever had maybe 2 representatives, and unfortunately they both passed away. So now what, like, how do we begin the process of that? And so talking them through making those kinds of connections that I have, to bringing in people that I know, to getting to know them, and just kind of leading that process in. So I guess it's all dependent on what an institution's goals are, what their ultimate goal is, as well as, I would say, their intent. I always ask people, what is your intention in doing this work? Is it just meant to fulfill a deadline? Is it just meant to fulfill like a quota of some sort? Or are you actually interested and invested in changing how Native American people are represented in your space? And if that's the case, which I hope it is for many people, then you actually had to dig deep and within to figure out some of those harder questions that I was discussing. You have to really sit with yourself and educate yourself on some of the biases you have, but also filling in those gaps of knowledge that you might not have. And that's okay. I often tell people that that's okay, that you don't have that knowledge, because I don't either. As a historian, I don't know everything. I'm very, right, I'm a Native American museum consultant. How niche is that? So like, like I have to, when I'm working in a new institution, I have to figure out like, okay, whose land I'm on? How were they removed, if at all? Like how many Native people are here? Like, I want to be able to self-educate myself so other people could feel like they can do that too, and not have it feel like it's a burden or a part of their job. Really, it's just about becoming a better person in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Another question in the chat: when doing a project, say an oral history project, how important is it to work with official representatives of the nation, such as an active cultural affairs director, as opposed to freelance consultants who are also from the nation but not working officially with the nation at the time?
I would say, and this is just my opinion, that any good consultant will make sure that you have access to a wide variety of people who you're talking to. So if, as a consultant, it wouldn't be okay for me to just for example, just to provide access to someone who's in tribal government. Like, if that's your goal, to talk with someone who's in tribal government, great. However, I want you to also talk to the grandma who that tribal government is affecting. I want you to also talk to the child how that child is being affected by sovereignty. I mean, that's a very poor example, or like loose example off the top of my head. But I believe that it's just as important. If you're doing this work and the first thing you're doing is talking to an official representative, that's great, because that's a first step in. There's nothing wrong with that at all. However, I also encourage people that, like, a lot of times maybe there's other things that you're missing out on by not reaching out and doing further work with like a grandma or like an auntie or a cousin. Like, the government is one thing. Are the people who are at the top, are all stars or famous, however you want to do that, are great to talk to. However, there's also people on the ground who are doing this every day who need to also have their voices heard. So I don't try to silo anyone's importance over the other. I think it's just, again, comes down to intent, the overall intent of the work that is being done.
Thank you for that. Thank you. We're still open for questions if anyone has any more.
I see one. Miranda said something about not believing in decolonization happening right now, but does believe in anti-colonial acts we can take. Can that be expanded on? Yes. I also did a talk about this when I was in New York, and I'll provide some links right now. It's and you can find it on my website. But I'm of the mind, so I realized earlier when I was done talking, oops, that was a direct message. I realized that when I was talking, I didn't explain my stance that well. For me, after working in such large institutions or I see how much, when people aren't as familiar with Native cultures, when they aren't as familiar with Native lived experiences, or Native people for that matter, there is this inherent need to hold on to what is safe. So, for example, like when I went into the field, I was guns blazing. I wanted to change everything. And like, I didn't care necessarily whose feet I stepped on. However, after being humbled a lot, I had to realize that not everyone is where I'm at in life. Not everyone has had to walk the same path I've had to. Not everyone has had that access to information. So how do I begin to meet people where they're at? And a lot of times when I was faced with those circumstances, and I wanted to say was like, when you have someone like me coming in, like change everything, people get scared because they've been doing this work for like 40 years, and then you're someone telling them that it's wrong, right? Or not wrong, but maybe not the right way anymore, right? People get scared. They want to hold on to their privileges. They want to hold on to what is familiar, which I totally understand now. But when that happens, a lot of times colonialism reproduces itself. A lot of times when one person is afraid of changing, then that reaction gets trickled down to me. So like, for example, if someone really didn't like what I had to say and it got reported, then, it's like, well, is it really about what I said, or is it how I said it? Is it because it's coming from a Native woman? Is it because it's coming from a brown woman? Is it because it's coming from someone who doesn't look exactly the same? Where are all these biases come from? And so I am of the mind that as long as there's people, and this isn't to say it's a bad thing, but when there's people who aren't as committed to the cause, or maybe there's people who just aren't on that wavelength yet, we have to develop a lot of humility, but then also have to develop, how do I help this person get to where I'm at, if at all? And to me, that means exposing them to a wide variety of literature, like making sure that the literature that they're reading is as inclusive as possible. That includes queer writers, Black writers, Southeast Asian writers, poets, artists. I try to make my approach to doing this work as inclusive and as intersectional as possible, because that's the only true way to liberation. And I feel that when in a lot of these spaces, because they're inherently colonial, right? They're built off of colonialism, not all of them, but a lot of them. They were meant to project colonialism and project colonial ideas. How can we then make that space non-colonial? Like, that's where I often step into it. So anti-colonial means like taking time to make sure that, my worldview, the lessons I've been taught as an Indigenous woman, are what I bring into every situation. Like I bring my whole self now into these spaces. I bring my whole being into these spaces without fear. I now, meet people where they're at. I understand that all of us benefit from colonialism in some way, shape, or form, right? So like with that understanding, I'm able to walk into a space that hopefully opens more doors for everyone else to feel like they can do the same thing as well.
Great, thank you. Looks like Tori Larson has their hand raised. Go right ahead, Tori.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Longtime fan, by the way. I am currently working at the Museum for Naturkunde in Berlin, which is the Natural History Museum. And we are doing a project called Guidelines for Handling Collections from Colonial Contexts. So naturally, I have lots of questions that I think you would have so many good things to say on, but something that you just said really stuck out to me. It reminds me of a conversation I've been having with a lot of my bosses, all of whom are German. And there is a very, we leave our emotions at the door sort of attitude, which, happens in academia here too, but is very firmly believed in there as well. So I think as I've engaged in this work and as I'm preparing to bring in potential collaborators, I really want to start doing groundwork about how do we make space for people's emotions in this, because so much of what my colleagues there uncover about the history of our collections is so violent and so hurtful. And yeah, I'm just curious what are some tips or things or even just meditations you have on making space for emotions and bringing your whole self into the process?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I've been asked that recently as well earlier today. I think that's the hardest part about working in a colonial institution as a Native person, is learning how to regulate your emotions in those spaces, because at some level you do have to learn how to regulate that, even though it's not necessarily fair. Only because, you know, for deadlines or whatever. But some of the things that get me through that are finding people who I know I'm safe with to be able to cry with, or maybe even scream with, or like, you know, or like yell into a pillow with. But, and I mean like good people, not people who have an agenda, not people who are even affiliated with the museum. Maybe they're affiliated with the work, but they're not affiliated with the museum, where you just feel safe, where you can vent out things. For me, and this wasn't a very big part of it, but like what I are very well received, but the reason why I was so vocal about my experiences at the field was because I hated this idea that we are becoming decolonial, when in reality it's not. And when you speak about those things, and you're trying to gain clout off of it, and I say clout very loosely, it creates this idea that this work is possible anywhere, and it is possible anywhere. It's just that there needs to be time, I think, for personal reflection as well. There needs to be patience. There's a really good article, Brandy McDonald wrote it. She's at the Museum of Us, which has a great anti-colonial department and decolonial department there, about the importance of taking a pause. So when you're doing colonialism, or when you're doing, I'm sorry, when you're engaging in anti-colonialism, it's important for your institution to take a pause and to assess, where are we? Why aren't emotions? And I think it's probably a cultural thing, but also in America, as I've witnessed, it's because there isn't that understanding that these items have deep meaning for us, that these items have deep significance for who we still are today, that they're still living and breathing entities who want to be home. I'm firmly of the mind that even if people don't understand that worldview, they at least should respect it. Or maybe that is a mantra. You don't have to understand the worldview, but you have to respect it. Because if you don't, then you're not actually being able to move forward in any way, and you're not able to actually build very good, beautiful relationships. And I don't need people to see those items as living, but I need them to understand that as an Indigenous woman, I do. And if you want to work with me, then you need to understand that. And you need to take into the fact that this item, that this ancestor is my relative. It is something that's important to me and my sense of understanding the world. And if we're allies in that, you would hold space for that. And if you were allies with that, you would allow those emotions to be free, no matter where they might go to. I don't think anger shouldn't be directed towards anyone, unless it's the person who's causing you harm, of course. But when it comes to this particular topic, a lot of places and people get offended by, like, when I act angry because something is stored. That anger is valid. It stored somewhere different than my homelands. That anger is valid, but that doesn't mean I get to then redirect it to the people who are doing the work. It means that I have to go home and pray and do what I need to do to feel good. And so I think, especially in other countries that since we're not there, Native people are not there, there is that misunderstanding of what those items actually mean to us and how they should actually be reinterpreted. I don't know if that answers it, but I do feel that it's important to always take time for yourself, no matter what you're doing, especially when it comes to these sorts of materials, because after having the experiences I do, I know that they affect us on a deep level, and that if we don't take care of ourselves, then we're not able to take care of them, and we're not able to fulfill their ultimate purpose either.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have one more question from the chat. Dr. Roberts, do you find that projects like yours are well accepted by national museum societies or organizations like the American Association for State and Local History?
Sorry, I'm listening. I feel like yes and no. I think that a lot of spaces like what I have to say, and they agree with it, but when it comes to implementing it, it's hard. And I think that again, it comes down to what are the intentions of those in charge. Because I recognized very quickly in this work that you have leadership who is in charge of driving these directives, and then you have the people beneath them who are in charge of fulfilling it. And when the directors are like dictating how something should look, the people underneath them are kind of left with like, well, we need to meet that goal. And then you're hearing from like Native people like, but wait, that doesn't work for us. So how do you find a middle ground? And that's where the real hard work comes in, because you realize that the ultimate director goal isn't what the Native communities want. And therefore, how do the people who are stuck doing the work get the work done? And so I think that there is a universal acceptance that things need to change, that we shouldn't be using decolonization as much anymore, that maybe land acknowledgements are only first steps to beginning collaboration. But I think that and I've had good experiences of being back in California that allow for certain hard histories to come up. But I think a lot of that has to do with the context of California and where we're at with tribal relations and tribal histories and things like that. Whereas in the Midwest, there isn't that much representation, or there isn't that much presence. And even in New York, even though I was only there for a little while, I recognized how there was still a lot more work that needed to be done to bringing about that history and bringing around that awareness. So I think that it resonates with people that they want to do it, but then they start to think of their bottom line, and then they start to freak out a little bit. And so I'm in a position of saying, like, it's okay to take time. Like, who says that any project needs to take 2 to 3 years? Like, why does it have to just be 2 to 3 years? Why not do something great for like 10 years and leave your coworkers with something that they can continue to build on, right? Like they can continue to actually do. Because I think we get stuck in the cycle of, we need to have all of this done and we need to do all of this work today. Otherwise it's going to disappear. And it's like, but whose idea is of it? Is it of them disappearing? Is it the institutions, or is it the people's? Because we're not going anywhere. So who needs to fall in line, so to speak? So I think institutions need to come a long way of realize what are their ultimate goals and what do they want to see happen, rather than being project driven. And I don't know if we're there. I don't know if, because a lot of us are project driven.
Yeah, and I guess a follow-up to that, do you think that smaller institutions are maybe more amenable to doing those longer term projects, perhaps than, you know, big national museums or other kind of cultural institutions?
Definitely. I have seen, you know, I was saying this to someone earlier too, that in museums, what happens a lot of times is like the collection that you have is like assembled, or like the way that the collection was assembled, I should say, was the result of a collector going out. So like, let's say, for example, in New York, for example, like a museum in New York might have a lot of cultural items from the plains, or it might have a lot of cultural items from the West. And so a lot of these big institutions who have these really big collections that don't have any local representation then don't know how to begin to build that local representation, because their collection says that they should be doing work with outside communities. And so I found that, which it should, but I found that with local smaller institutions, because they're more dedicated to the local history, because they're more dedicated to telling one specific story, it is easier to begin to develop those long-term relationships, because there's not like 1,000 other things that need to happen on the back end. They're able to very much focus on one particular aspect of the work.
Great, thank you. I think we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap it up tonight. Lori, yeah, feel free to unmute and ask.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for your presentations. I'm from the Northeast and a tiny local history organization. But to me, the local Native history is so remote, and there's so few artifacts left. I think that it's, and even trying to pinpoint what tribe was in a vicinity it can be difficult. So I sort of feel, Plains Indian people have an easier time because it's more immediate. All of our, Northeastern Indians were removed so long ago that they really have little, footprint on the current land. So any ideas how to bridge those gaps?
Thank you for that. I think that there's an opportunity there to provide education about that removal. That there is an opportunity to provide information and to make space. So for communities that have been relocated to come back in and begin making or being able to tell their stories. So what I mean is the communities that are no longer on that land, where are they, and how can your institution begin to think about how can we tell that story of relocation through their lens of the removed? So like how would they want to have their items interpreted? Maybe there's things that they can lend, or maybe there's other institutions that can borrow. Again, I don't know all the details to your situation, but I do think that there are ways of discussing this history in a way that bring about awareness that hadn't been there before. And I will say that even though that community may have been removed so far long ago, that they have still probably, my best guess, maintained valuable connections to that land since time immemorial, and that there are stories there and that they can help educate about how to take care of the local ecosystem or some things of that nature, or have an opportunity to just discuss some things about their history that another place won't be able to. And I think, of course, again, it comes down to you or whoever works with you having to do a lot of the historical background, as it seems like you have, but then also thinking about how do we then begin to make space for those who have been removed in the space that I have now.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for this evening. It's really incredible to have you here and to talk about these really important topics. I want to invite everyone on this call to register for our talk next week with Dr. Joe Stallman. We'll be talking about Indian country, current issues, and more. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight, and hope everyone has a wonderful holiday weekend coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.